Oklahoma is the land of second, third, and last chances. Who were the people that made it so? We'll trace the golden threads they've woven through Oklahoma history. The Red River Institute and Atwoods present Oklahoma Gold. I'm Gwen Faulconer-Lippert, along with award-winning author and Southern Nazarene University historian John J. Dwyer. We'll dig for the golden nuggets of Oklahoma history, here now on Oklahoma Gold. November 1971 was the football game of the century? John J. Dwyer, tell me this story.
What a story it was, Gwen Faulconer-Lippert. A game of the century that lived up to its billing. This was a contest between not just the number 1 and 2 ranked teams in the country, but very possibly the greatest defense ever to play college football and the greatest offense ever to play college football. The Nebraska Cornhuskers, undefeated across 3 seasons, undefeated national champions, with 25 players who would, on that one roster that would eventually go to play in the National Football League. The University of Oklahoma Sooners with maybe the greatest college football tradition in American history. But that was a tradition that was rusty on this cold, dark Thanksgiving Day, November 1971, because the Sooners had not been playing up for some years, at least consistently, to the lofty standards of the past. But this was the team that was bringing it all back together. This was the game that furnished sports legend, Oklahoma newspaper sportswriter Berry Tramel the words about OU's quarterback that day, Jack Mildren, and why Jack Mildren was, according to Berry Tramel, the most important player in OU history. What he did that afternoon on that Owen Field when the whole world was watching. And when I say the whole world was watching. We're talking the greatest newspapers, magazines of the day, the national magazines. Their front covers were garlanded with the lead up to this game. And in fact, I think you were a part of that, if I remember, Gwen, because you were a person of very special note and renown then and now. You were the roughneck queen for OU.
And if people don't know what that is, that's the girl in the Sooner schooner that's waving the paddle and holding on for her life. There are no seat belts in the Sooner schooner. Well, there might be now, but there weren't in 1971. You are so right. And 55 million people watched the game that day, John.
Yeah, 55 million people. This was a day when there was one game broadcast nationally on TV that day. The whole nation watched one game, and this was the one game. This was a game that had, of the 22 all-conference players that year in the Big 8 Conference, 17 of the 22 players played on these two teams, OU and Nebraska. The end of the year, the final rankings, the Big 8 Conference had the number 1, number 2, and number 3 ranked teams in the final rankings. And it wasn't even close because the number 1 and 2 ranked teams destroyed the 4th and 5th ranked teams in bowl games. Thanksgiving Day, 1971, you were down there. You were the roughneck queen riding the schooner, and fortunately you got to ride it several times that day. I was watching on TV with my family from Duncan, Oklahoma, but you were there. What's your recollections? What was the atmosphere? What was the feeling, the build-up as kickoff loomed that day on Thanksgiving between OU and Nebraska, 1971, game of the century?
Well, the word electricity doesn't even cover it. You know, it was sold out. People were jammed in there, and as many people as could possibly be, standing room only. And what people don't know about those ponies, Boomer 2, Sooner 3, because so many ponies before that, they had been bred special to pull that Sooner schooner. Dr. Bartlett, I believe, from Sapulpa, was the creator and gave them to the University of Oklahoma. And those ponies were so well trained that they would pull them down that ramp and put the drop cloth down because of health and safety reasons. And then the ponies would stand there patiently until the crowd swelled. When the crowd made any noise, then the ponies would tense up and get ready to go on a moment's notice. And so on that day, those ponies were electrified as well. They could sense what the crowd was like. And of course, because Nebraska's colors are red and white, as well as OU's colors, there was a sea of red and white that was non-stop all the way around, inside and out. And, I'm remembering now, because we talked about this, that I actually had a class with Greg Pruitt, who's one of the top players. And Greg Pruitt would come to class the day before this OU-Nebraska game, and he had on this T-shirt. And on the front, it said, hello, and on the back of his T-shirt, it said, goodbye. So that day, all the Roughnecks, now, the Roughnecks, for those that don't know, are the men on the field. There were only men Roughnecks in 1971, and there was one queen, one woman. And so I got to ride in the Sooner Schooner because I was the queen. And all the Roughnecks carried those sawed-off shotguns that had to be retooled somewhere in their history because they were too short and they had to be retooled. And as you recall, every time OU scored, the Roughnecks would fire the shotguns, and the ponies, Boomer and Sooner, would run out on the field and make a big circle and then run back in under, going down the ramp. And yes, probably people remembered that many times the Roughnecks would spoof people and act like someone's head had been chopped off. But we did have to duck to go down under. But back to the game.
Well, and what a game it was. You mentioned Greg Pruitt, who's, of course, OU's All-American halfback that year. And people may not remember that this was an uphill battle. OU was the underdog by several points. Nebraska hadn't been beaten by anyone in a couple of years. No one had come close to them. OU had an okay defense that year. It was a good defense, not a great one. And for this game, several of the starters were out. Others were walking wounded. So the crowd watching had no idea just what an uphill battle it was for the Sooners to be taking on perhaps the greatest overall college football team in history. And yet, here we were, Nebraska getting up 14-3, the Sooners fighting back. Greg Pruitt was shut down. The Nebraska game plan took away that vaunted outside wishbone electrifying attack. So quarterback Jack Mildren took it on his own shoulders. Leon Crosswhite, my old buddy and friend from Hennessy, was just the big, tough fullback. And watching a replay of this game recently, he had run 10 times for over 50 yards early in the second quarter and then went out with an injury, which may have tipped the balance of the game that day. But nonetheless, the Sooners fought back with Jack Mildren and his old high school buddy Johnny Harrison to take the lead at 17-14 just before halftime, Gwen.
And we will leave it at halftime. The Golden Nugget when we return. This is Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history through the stories we remember. The game of the century, November 1971, OU, Nebraska, and OU was winning at halftime. But then, just like the weather that day, you made a reference to this, John J. Dwyer. The game started, it was a beautiful sunny day, I think 70 degrees, beautiful. But by the end of the game that day, I swear it was 40 degrees. John J. Dwyer, did OU win that day in your estimation?
The greatest clip that never was. And anyone who's familiar with that game at all knows the play to which I'm referring. It was the separator. There was a spectacular punt return for a touchdown in the first half. It was actually, I believe, the first score of the day. Nebraska's Heisman Trophy winner, Johnny Rogers, an electrifying, wonderful run down the field on a punt for a touchdown. And there were not one, not two, but three calls that all Sooner fans then and since would say should have been called as major penalties, clips, and holes that allowed him to get loose and get down the field for that touchdown. One in particular was the clip on Johnny Harrison, quarterback Jack Mildren's high school buddy from Abilene, Texas. And I just put the evidence out there for anyone who wants to watch it. It's still on there on the YouTube replay of this game, and you can watch little Johnny Harrison racing down the sidelines and catching, outrunning, and about to tackle Johnny Rogers 20, 30 yards out from the end zone when he is wiped out on a clip by a Nebraska player coming across the field. And it was not called, and that touchdown, punt return for a touchdown, had a fateful influence on the outcome of the game. But that being said, we talked a moment ago about heading into the second half. The Sooners had crafted a narrow 17-14 lead against a shocked Nebraska team that hadn't lost in, I believe, 30 games, was defending national champions. And the Cornhuskers came storming back to take a seemingly insurmountable 28-17 lead early in the fourth quarter. And that's when the legend of Jack Mildren kicked into play, and he led OU to two epic down-the-field marches for touchdowns that pulled the Sooners within 28-24 and then actually gave OU the lead at 31-28 with just 7 minutes to go in the game. And it's remarkable because this was a Nebraska team that I don't know if anyone that year came within 6 touchdowns of them in any other game. And again, they beat the number 2, 3, they beat 4 different teams that were in the top 10, and none came close other than in this game. So this was a down-to-the-wire game of the century in every sense of the word. And how that turned out, as you remember, you were on the field, Nebraska was able to score with just a minute and a half, less than a minute and a half to go in the game, to go ahead 35-31. People don't remember that OU actually outgained the Huskers. The Sooners ran all over the field against that considered the greatest defense in college football history, nearly 500 yards total offense that day. And OU's last possession with just seconds to go in the game, the same Johnny Harrison that almost caught Johnny Rogers on that touchdown run earlier in the game, he actually got open behind the entire Nebraska secondary with seconds to go. Jack Mildren's pass, he was hurriedly rushed by a defensive line, all 4 of whose players went on to be NFL stars. And his pass went just beyond the outstretched hands of Johnny Harrison, and the game finished 35-31. Quickly, for me, as a 15-year-old kid in Duncan, Oklahoma, you know, the OU Sooners at that point, it wasn't that long after the Dust Bowl and the second Dust Bowl in the 50s and struggling Oklahoma economy in the 60s. In a lot of ways, the Oklahoma Sooner football team carried the banner for our people nationally. They carried it out front of us in a way that showed us to be not just ordinary and not just good, but extraordinary with that football team in that day. And I remember I retired to my bedroom, Glenn, for the duration of the day, that Thanksgiving day. I missed getting dinner that night. I locked my door. My mom knew that one time to stay away.
It was the coldest ending to a ball game I have ever experienced. The weather changed, the atmosphere changed, and we all froze.
I'll close out my thoughts here real quickly with words in honor of Jack Mildren and Johnny Harrison, those 2 great Sooner legends that we've mentioned several times, who both died young. In the immortal words of A.E. Hausman, to an athlete dying young, and I dedicate it to those boys of that distant fall day and others on their team who are struggling now, some of them with conditions related to having played football back in that day when the helmets weren't that solid. Now you will not swell the rout of lads that wore their honors out, runners whom renown outran, and the name died before the man.
The Golden Nugget, and that's Oklahoma Gold.